Alright everyone, let's talk about security vulnerabilities in software. Specifically, we're going to be diving deep into the world of SQL injection attacks, a surprisingly common and potentially devastating issue that every developer needs to be aware of. In the simplest terms, imagine someone sneaking malicious code into your application through, say, an innocent-looking login form. This code then hijacks your database queries, potentially handing over control of your entire database to the attacker. Not good, right? We've all heard the horror stories of data breaches and leaks. This is one way those nightmares become reality. So whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting out, stick around. In this video, we're going to break down exactly what SQL injection is, how it works, the different types of SQL injection, and most importantly, how you can protect yourself and your applications from falling victim to it. This is essential knowledge in today's digital landscape. Let's make sure you're equipped to write secure code. So what exactly is SQL injection, or SQLI as the cool kids call it? Well, in a nutshell, it's a type of attack that exploits vulnerabilities in how your application interacts with its database. It all starts with SQL, or Structured Query Language, the language used to communicate with databases. You use it to retrieve, insert, update, and delete data. Now, imagine you have a login form on your website. A user enters their username and password, and your application constructs a SQL query to check if those credentials exist in your database. Sounds simple enough, right? But here's where things get tricky. Let's say you're not sanitizing user input properly. An attacker could enter something sneaky into those username or password fields, something that's not just text, but actual SQL code. If your application blindly takes that input and plops it right into your SQL query, well, you've just opened Pandora's box. Instead of checking for a valid username and password, the database now receives and executes the attacker's injected SQL code. And depending on how vulnerable your system is, they could potentially read sensitive data, modify or delete existing data, or even worse, gain complete control over your database server. Think of it like this. You ask someone to hand you a wrench from your toolbox, but they instead hand you a hammer and tell you to smash your computer with it. Not ideal, right? That's essentially what SQL injection does. It tricks your application into executing commands you never intended. The implications of a successful SQL injection attack can be absolutely devastating. We're talking about sensitive user data being leaked, financial information being stolen, your entire system being held hostage for ransom, the list goes on. And the scary part is, this type of attack is more common than you might think. But don't worry, this isn't a lost cause. Just like any vulnerability, there are ways to protect yourself and your applications from SQL injection attacks. And that's what we're going to be diving into throughout the rest of this video. We'll also explore the different types of SQL injection attacks and how to defend against them, with examples prepared in C#. Alright, let's get our hands dirty and look at some actual code to see how SQL injection can play out in a C# application. Don't worry, we'll keep it simple and easy to understand. Let's say you're building a simple login form for a website. You've got your username and password fields, and when a user hits that login button, your C# code constructs a SQL query to check if their credentials are legit. Now let's say your code looks something like this. And keep in mind, this is A of what to do. You've got a string variable for your SQL query, and you're just concatenating the user input directly into that query string. So if a user enters their username as legit user and their password as password 123, the query might look something like select asterisk from users where username = legit user and password = password 123. Looks harmless enough, right? Well, here's where the danger comes in. What if, instead of entering a regular password, an attacker enters something like this, or 1 = 1. Now when your code constructs the query, it ends up looking like this. Select asterisk from users where username = legit user and password = or 1 = 1. See what just happened? That little snippet of code the attacker injected completely changes the logic of your SQL query. The overall 1 = 1 part is always true, so the database will return any row where the username is legit user, regardless of the password. Boom, the attacker just bypassed your authentication, and they didn't even need to know the actual password. This is just a basic example, of course. In reality, SQL injection attacks can be much more complex and sophisticated, exploiting all sorts of vulnerabilities in your code. But the underlying principle is the same: injecting malicious code into your SQL queries to make your database do things you never intended. There are several types of SQL injection attacks, including error-based, union-based, and blind SQL injection. Error-based SQL injection relies on error messages from the database to gain information about its structure. Union-based SQL injection uses the union SQL operator to combine the results of two or more select statements. Blind SQL injection doesn't rely on error messages but instead infers information based on the behavior of the database. Okay, so we've seen how SQL injection works in theory, but you might be thinking, does this stuff actually happen in the real world? Oh, you bet it does. And the consequences can be absolutely brutal. Let's take a trip down memory lane and revisit some of the most infamous and cringeworthy data breaches where SQL injection was the culprit. Back in 2011, Sony PlayStation Network suffered a massive breach that affected over 77 million user accounts. We're talking about names, addresses, email addresses, login credentials, even credit card information, all compromised because of, you guessed it, an SQL injection vulnerability. The aftermath was a PR nightmare for Sony, costing them an estimated $171 million in damages. Ouch! And remember back in 2017 when Equifax, a credit reporting agency, announced a massive data breach that exposed the personal information of over 147 million people? Yeah, that was SQL injection too. They failed to patch a known vulnerability in their systems, and attackers swooped in and made off with a treasure trove of sensitive data, including social security numbers, birth dates, and driver's license numbers. The fallout was immense, with lawsuits, investigations, and a whole lot of angry people. These are just a couple of high-profile examples, but the truth is, SQL injection attacks happen all the time, often targeting smaller businesses and organizations that might not have the same level of security expertise or resources as the big players. And the impact can be just as devastating, leading to financial losses, reputational damage, and even legal repercussions. Now let's talk about the types of SQL injection attacks. There are several, but the most common ones include classic SQL injection, blind SQL injection, and out-of-band SQL injection. Classic SQL injection involves directly inserting malicious SQL code into a query, often through user input fields. Blind SQL injection is a bit trickier, as it doesn't return data directly. Instead, attackers infer information based on the application's responses. Out-of-band SQL injection is less common but can be very effective. It relies on the database server's ability to make HTTP or DNS requests to deliver the payload. Understanding these types can help in crafting better defenses against SQL injection attacks, especially when developing applications in C#. Alright, enough doom and gloom. Let's shift gears and talk about how to actually protect your applications from these nasty SQL injection attacks. Don't worry, it's not as complicated as you might think. The key here is to stop treating user input like it's your best friend. Remember, when it comes to security, trust no one, especially not data coming in from the outside world. So how do we do that? Well, one of the most effective techniques is something called parameterized queries or prepared statements. Instead of concatenating user input directly into your SQL query string, you create a template with placeholders for the values you want to insert. These placeholders act like variables, and you pass the actual user input separately as parameters when you execute the query. This way, the database server knows exactly which parts of the query are data and which parts are commands, preventing any malicious code from sneaking in. Let me show you what I mean with some C# code. Instead of that vulnerable code we saw earlier, you want to use something like this. You create a scale command object with your parameterized query string like select asterisk from users where username equals sign at username and password equals sign at password. Then you add parameters to the command object, specifying the parameter name and the corresponding user input value. Finally, you execute the query using the command object. This way, even if a user tries to inject malicious code, it gets treated as just another data value, preventing any harm to your database. Another crucial aspect of preventing SQL injection is input validation. Before you even think about using user input in your SQL queries, you need to sanitize it. This means checking if the input conforms to the expected format and data type. Is it a string, an integer? How long can it be? You can use built-in functions and regular expressions to enforce these rules and reject any input that looks suspicious. Think of it like a bouncer at a club. You want to make sure only the right kind of data gets through the door. And remember, Security is not a one-time thing, it's an ongoing process. Make sure you're keeping your frameworks and libraries up to date, as they often include security patches and updates to address known vulnerabilities. Stay informed about the latest security best practices and consider using security analysis tools to help you identify and fix potential vulnerabilities in your code. Now, let's briefly talk about the types of SQL injection attacks. In-band SQL injection is the most common type, where the attacker uses the same communication channel to launch the attack and gather results. Inferential SQL injection, also known as blind SQL injection, is where the attacker sends payloads to the server and observes the response to infer the structure of the database. Out-of-band SQL injection is less common and occurs when the attacker uses different channels to perform the attack and retrieve data, often relying on features enabled on the database server. By understanding these types and implementing the prevention techniques we've discussed, you can significantly reduce the risk of SQL injection attacks in your applications. Alright, we've covered a lot of ground here today, from the basics of SQL injection to some pretty scary real-world examples. But the most important takeaway here is that preventing SQL injection attacks is not some optional extra credit assignment. It's absolutely crucial for the safety and security of your applications and your users. We live in a world where data is king, and protecting that data is more important than ever. SQL injection is a serious threat, but it's a threat that can be mitigated with the right knowledge and practices. By understanding how these attacks work, and by implementing secure coding techniques like parameterized queries and input validation, you can build robust and resilient applications that can withstand even the most determined attackers. Think of it like this. You wouldn't leave your front door unlocked at night, would you? Of course not. You'd make sure it's securely locked to keep unwanted visitors out. The same principle applies to your applications. You need to keep those doors locked tight by writing secure code and following best practices to prevent any vulnerabilities that attackers could exploit. And remember, security is not a one-and-done deal. It's an ongoing process of learning, adapting, and staying one step ahead of the bad guys. So keep those security skills sharp, stay informed about the latest threats, and never underestimate the importance of writing secure code. There are several types of SQL injection attacks, including classic SQL injection, blind SQL injection, and out-of-band SQL injection. Each type has its own methods and techniques, but they all aim to exploit vulnerabilities in your application's database interactions. By understanding these different types, you can better prepare and protect your applications, especially when working with C#. So, there you have it. A crash course on SQL injection and how to protect your applications from it. Remember, security should be a top priority in everything you build. By adopting secure coding practices, you're not just writing lines of code, you're building a fortress around your applications and your users' data. Never underestimate the importance of staying informed about security vulnerabilities. The world of cybersecurity is constantly evolving, with new threats emerging all the time. Make it a habit to stay updated on the latest security best practices, attend webinars, follow security blogs, and be an active part of the security community. And hey, if you found this video helpful, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and don't forget to share it with your fellow developers. Let's spread the word and make the digital world a safer place, one line of code at a time. Until next time, happy coding. And remember, there are different types of SQL injection attacks, such as union-based, error-based, and blind SQL injection. Understanding these can help you better protect your applications.